Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we'll be covering how training variables can be manipulated for different athletic qualities. First, we need to establish what training variables we have that can be manipulated to train various qualities. The variables are number of repetitions, number of sets, rest periods between sets, the intensity of the exercise, such as load or speed, the frequency of training, and where to position the quality in the training session. When writing a training program, these 6 variables can be altered to suit the particular athletic quality that is being targeted. We will now cover how these 6 variables can be manipulated to best train the following qualities: skill practice, maximal speed, power output, maximal strength, hypertrophy or muscle growth, and conditioning or endurance. So first, we will start with skill. Skill practice is a very general term and can mean many different things depending on the sport. For example, skill for a javelin thrower would mean becoming more efficient at throwing the javelin, while skill practice for a soccer player would include passing, shooting, dribbling, heading, etc. under pressurized and unpredictable situations. However, skill practice in all forms have common general characteristics that should be followed for best performance. Rep ranges for skill practice should generally be fairly low to ensure quality is maintained. Skill practice is all about performing the movement as efficiently as possible and avoiding ingraining poor movement patterns. Set numbers for skill practice should be moderate. Lots of sets would be a bad idea, as fatigue may accumulate and movement patterns may reduce in quality. Although, it is also important to ensure that enough skill is being practiced. Therefore, a very low number of sets may reduce total exposure to the skill. Rest periods should be enough to allow full recovery to ensure the highest quality of movement. This actual time could vary between sports. For example, throwing in American football would require much less time for full recovery than running a maximal speed sprint. The intensity required for skill practice should be specific to the skill. While most skills have no external loading, some skills do. For example, a hammer thrower would be best to practice the hammer throw with a competition weight hammer and performing this skill with maximal intensity. This will be most specific to the sporting skill and have most transfer to performance. Frequency for skill practice should be high. Skill practice requires very finely tuned coordination, and even small levels of fatigue can inhibit performance. Therefore, the total volume of skill practice should be spread throughout the week to ensure lower fatigue, rather than to do the same volume on fewer days. And lastly, skill training should always be the first quality performed. This is because it again requires low levels of fatigue, and it is also not very fatiguing in itself, which means that it won't negatively affect qualities performed later in the training session. Moving on now to training for maximal speed. When talking about speed training, we are essentially referring to any form of maximal effort running. This could be straight line running over various distances or change of direction training. Reps and sets can be clustered together for speed training, as you would usually only perform one effort at a time. And this can be termed either a set or a repetition. In any case, we want reps to be low to ensure maximal speed of running. If the athlete performs too many reps, they will become fatigued and absolute speed will reduce. This will cause us to run at a submaximal pace and therefore no longer training speed like we intended to do. Rest periods between reps of speed training should allow for full recovery. This will ensure that fatigue doesn't reduce absolute speed of performance. A general rule of thumb is to allow 1 minute of rest for every 10 meters ran. So if an athlete is performing 30-meter sprints, 3 minutes of rest should be adequate. Intensity of sprints should always be absolutely maximal when trying to get faster. Running at a submaximal pace will simply not improve speed. You need to run fast to be able to run fast. The frequency of speed training can vary between athletes. Team sport athletes may already be hitting maximal speeds at some point during their training week and may not need much additional speed work, while track athletes may be training speed specifically up to 3 times per week. 2 to 3 times per week would be enough to yield performance improvements, while once per week should be enough to maintain speed qualities. Speed training should always be at or near the beginning of a training session. This is because fatigue from other training will affect speed performance much more than speed training will affect other training. The only quality that may be performed prior to speed training is skill practice, if done in the same session. Power type training includes exercises which are ballistic in nature, meaning they have no deceleration phase. Any form of throws, jumps, or plyometrics can be included in this category. Reps for power training should be low to moderate. Once again, this is because the purpose of power training is to develop maximal output, not endurance. So high repetitions will fatigue the athlete and power output will drop. Rep ranges of 3 to 6 are probably the sweet spot when it comes to resisted power exercises like weighted jumps, while plyometric exercises may use sets in the 6 to 12 range. The number of sets used for power training should be moderate. 2 to 4 sets of maximal effort power training should definitely be enough of a stimulus for adaptation. If performance deteriorates by more than 10%, no additional sets should be performed. Rest periods for power training should again allow for near complete or complete recovery. This will allow output to be maximal since fatigue won't mask performance. The intensity used for power training should always be maximal. However, the load and speed being used will depend on what quality is being trained. For more force-dominant power exercises, the loads used will be heavier, which means the speed of movement will be slower. For velocity-dominant power exercises, the load will be less, while the speed of movement will be greater. That being said, the exercise should always be performed as fast as possible, regardless of the load. Frequency of power training should be low to moderate. 2 to 3 sessions per week should be sufficient to improve power output. These sessions can be undulated throughout the week to focus on slightly different qualities. For example, one session could be an unloaded plyometric day, while the other session could focus more on loaded power training, such as squat jumps. Power training should be included in the session before any strength, hypertrophy, or endurance training, but after any skill or speed training. This is because power training is fairly sensitive to fatigue and will be affected by strength or endurance training. However, skill and speed training shouldn't affect power training very much at all, although power training will likely affect skill and speed training. When talking about strength training, we are essentially referring to training for maximal strength. So this would be any heavy compound lifts aimed at improving its 1 rep max. Low reps for this type of lifting should be used in the 1 to 6 rep range. This is because lower reps will allow heavier loads to be used, which will develop the specific neural motor patterns required for maximal force output. The number of sets to be used would likely be moderate to high for maximal strength training. More sets means more total volume, which may contribute to hypertrophy and further develop strength. However, too many sets with heavy loads may cause joint issues over time. Rest periods between sets of strength training should allow for full recovery in order for high strength outputs to be performed. Up to 5 minutes may be required for very strong athletes, but usually around 2 to 4 minutes should be sufficient. The intensity of strength training will be very high. Loads used will be heavy since the number of reps performed per set will be low. Again, the heavy loads are required for specific neural adaptations to be built. Strength training frequency can vary quite substantially. This will depend on the individual characteristics of the athlete and how many lifts they are performing per week. In general, a frequency of 1 to 3 times per week should be sufficient for each lift. Like power training, these sessions can be undulated throughout the week, For example, an athlete who squats twice per week may perform one session in the 1 to 3 rep range and the other session in the 4 to 6 rep range. Strength training should be performed after skill, speed, and power training, but before hypertrophy and endurance training. Maximal strength isn't very fatigue sensitive compared to skill, speed, and power training, but will still likely be affected by high volume hypertrophy and endurance training. Moving on now to hypertrophy training. This refers to any form of resistance training aimed at improving muscle size. The number of reps for a given exercise when training for hypertrophy should be greater than 6 and can be as high as 30. If reps are performed in ranges above 12, then they must be taken close to failure to maximize the hypertrophy stimulus. This is to ensure that all the muscle fibers are recruited to lift the weight. The number of sets is of great importance for hypertrophy training. In general, the more sets performed per muscle group, the more growth they will receive. However, the more volume done, the less additional growth the muscle will receive. A general rule of thumb is to stick to between 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week. Rest periods between sets can vary for hypertrophy training. Generally, longer rest periods cause greater growth simply because it allows more weight and/or reps to be performed. However, the longer you rest, the less sets you can perform in the same session. Therefore, compound lifts should be given longer rest periods of around 1 to 3 minutes, while more isolated exercises can be given shorter rest periods of 1 to 2 minutes. The load used for hypertrophy training should be reflective of the rep ranges being used. For example, if reps of 10 to 12 are being performed, a load which is challenging in this range should be selected. Frequency of hypertrophy training can again be quite variable. Frequency itself may not play much of a role in growing muscle, it is more so a product of how the total weekly volume can be split. For example, the same volume could be split up into 2 larger sessions or 3 smaller sessions, and the net volume would be equal. Practically speaking, hypertrophy training 2 to 4 times per muscle group per week is a good guideline. Hypertrophy training should be the last thing performed in a training session unless endurance training will follow. An athlete doesn't need to be in a low fatigue state to get a hypertrophy stimulus, and hypertrophy training will have a big impact on other following training. Lastly, we will cover endurance training. Endurance training essentially refers to any form of training aimed at improving resistance to fatigue. So running, cycling, swimming, repeated sprints, etc. will all fall under this category. The number of reps, sets, and rest performed for endurance training will depend on the type of training being performed. Only 1 rep of 1 set may be performed if the endurance training consists of a 50-kilometer cycle at a constant pace with no rest. Or multiple reps may be performed if the session consists of repeated sprints with short rest intervals. Intensity should also be specific to the sport. Team sport requires very high intensity efforts with short rest periods, while a marathon requires a constant pace of slower running. The frequency of endurance training will be variable for different athletes. Specific endurance athletes may do endurance training 4 times per week, while team sport athletes may get all their endurance work from practicing their sport. Endurance training should ideally be separated from anaerobic training by 24 hours. This will minimize any potential interference effect. However, if endurance training must be performed in the same session as anaerobic training, it should be positioned last. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.